The first thing people notice about our town is the smell. Fresh bread before sunrise. Cinnamon rolls cooling behind fogged-up windows. Butter melting into warm pastry long before most people have even opened their eyes. It's the kind of place where everyone knows which house belongs to whom, where old men drink coffee at the same table every morning, and where news travels faster than the delivery truck. I never planned on staying there. After finishing community college, I told myself I was only taking the bakery job until I figured out what I actually wanted to do. A few months, maybe 6 at most. Then I'd move somewhere bigger. Somewhere anonymous. That was nearly a year ago. By then, I'd learned how to shape dough before I was fully awake, how to decorate cakes without ruining them, and how to smile at customers who insisted on telling the same stories every Saturday morning. It wasn't exciting. But it was peaceful. Until Charles walked through the front door. It was 6:15 on a rainy Monday. I was stacking fresh loaves onto the front display when the bell above the entrance jingled. A tall guy stepped inside, carrying a worn backpack over one shoulder. His dark jacket was damp from the rain, and he looked around with the expression of someone trying not to feel completely lost. He couldn't have been much older than me. Maybe 24. 25. Dark hair. Tired eyes. Calm expression. Our owner, Mrs. Reynolds, immediately appeared from the kitchen. "You must be Charles." He smiled politely. "I hope I'm not late." "5 minutes early," she answered. "Perfect." She pointed toward me. "Timothy, this is our new baker. Charles just moved here from Pine Creek." I wiped flour from my hands before shaking his. "Nice to meet you." "Likewise." His handshake was firm but brief. Nothing unusual. If someone had told me that moment would completely change my life, I would have laughed. Mrs. Reynolds gave him a quick tour while I went back to arranging pastries. Even without trying, I kept noticing him. Not because he was especially loud or charismatic. Actually, it was the opposite. Charles listened more than he talked. When Mrs. Reynolds explained something, he paid complete attention. When customers greeted him, he smiled politely without forcing conversation. Even when one of the older regulars asked 3 unnecessary questions about where he came from, he answered every one patiently. Small towns can be overwhelming if you're new. People don't mean to interrogate you. They're just curious. By lunch, everyone already knew there was a new employee. By dinner, half the town probably knew he'd moved into the small apartment above Miller's hardware store. That's just how things worked here. Around 2 in the afternoon, the bakery finally became quiet. The breakfast rush was over. Only a few customers wandered in every 15 or 20 minutes. Charles stood beside the espresso machine, carefully reading the instruction sticker. "You've never used one?" I asked. He glanced over. "It shows?" "A little." He laughed softly. "I worked at another bakery." "So what's different?" "No coffee." I blinked. "No coffee?" "They only sold bread." I stared at him. "I don't think that's legal." That earned an actual laugh. Not loud. Just genuine. "You'll have to teach me." "I can do that." 5 minutes later, he accidentally sprayed milk foam across half the counter. He looked horrified. "I'm sorry." I couldn't help laughing. "It's okay. I broke it already." "You didn't." "I definitely did." "You definitely didn't." He looked at the mess, then back at me. "You seem suspiciously calm." "I've seen worse." "How much worse?" "One guy somehow exploded whipped cream onto the ceiling." "How?" "I still don't know." Charles shook his head. "I think I feel better." That was the first real conversation we had. Nothing important. Nothing memorable. Except somehow. It was. Over the next couple of weeks, working together became surprisingly easy. Our schedules matched almost perfectly. Most mornings started before sunrise. I'd unlock the front door while Charles was already in the kitchen preparing dough. He moved quietly. Always focused. Never rushed. Sometimes we'd work for an hour before saying more than 3 words. Oddly enough, it never felt awkward. One morning I walked into the kitchen carrying 2 coffees. I guessed. He looked up from measuring flour. You guessed? I didn't know how you take coffee. So, I bought one black. And? The other has cream and sugar. He stared at both cups. So statistically one of these belongs to me. Exactly. He smiled. Black. I handed it over. I knew it. You literally just guessed. I prefer calling it intuition. He shook his head, still smiling. You're impossible. That became our rhythm. Little conversations between trays of bread. Quiet jokes while washing mixing bowls. Sharing leftover pastries after closing because Mrs. Reynolds refused to let anything good go to waste. Sometimes we'd sit on overturned flour buckets behind the bakery, eating warm croissants while watching delivery trucks come and go. Charles never talked much about why he moved. I didn't push. Everyone has reasons. Small towns teach you patience. Eventually people tell you things when they're ready. One evening, after locking up, we walked toward the parking lot together. Rain had started again. I forgot my umbrella, I muttered. Charles looked at the sky. So did I. We both stood there for a second. Then laughed. Guess we're getting soaked. My apartment's only 3 blocks. My truck's too. Race you? He looked at me. You really think you're faster? I know I am. You've clearly never carried 50-pound bags of flour. Oh? You'll lose. We'll see. 3 minutes later we were both completely drenched. Charles reached the hardware store first. Barely. I won. You cheated. I absolutely didn't. You started running before I counted. You never started counting. Exactly. He laughed harder than I'd heard before. Standing under the tiny awning outside his building, both of us soaked from head to toe, I realized something. I'd had more fun during that ridiculous 3-minute sprint than I'd had in months. He unlocked the front door. See you tomorrow? 5:30. I'll bring coffee. So now you're copying me? I'm improving your system. I pointed at him. That's theft. He disappeared inside, still laughing. As I drove home through empty streets, windshield wipers struggling against the rain, I caught myself smiling for no reason. At least, no reason I wanted to admit. Because at that point, Charles was just my coworker. Nothing more. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The bakery had a rhythm that never changed. By 4:30 every morning the ovens were already hot. By 5, the first trays of sourdough were rising. At 6, the smell of fresh bread drifted through Main Street, almost acting like an alarm clock for half the town. And somewhere between kneading dough, filling pastry cases, and pretending we weren't exhausted before sunrise, Charles quietly became the best part of my day. It happened so gradually that I barely noticed. One Tuesday morning I arrived carrying 2 paper bags. Charles looked up from weighing flour. What's that? Breakfast. We literally work in a bakery. I know. So, I wanted something that wasn't bread. He laughed. You've been here long enough. I think I've reached my bread limit. Impossible. Yesterday I ate 3 croissants. Those are rookie numbers. He folded his arms dramatically. I had 6. You're lying. I absolutely am. I handed him a breakfast sandwich. For someone who claims bread isn't enough. It isn't. He took one bite and nodded approvingly. Okay, this is worth cheating on bread. Mrs. Reynolds walked in just in time to hear that sentence. I don't even want to know. Neither of us corrected her. Customers loved Charles. Mostly because he listened. Mrs. Jenkins, who came in every Wednesday morning, somehow spent 20 minutes telling him about her grandson's baseball games. Mr. Carter insisted on explaining fishing techniques while Charles nodded politely. Even children seemed drawn to him. One little girl came in clutching a stuffed rabbit. She pointed at the cinnamon rolls. Do rabbits eat these? Charles looked completely serious. Only on birthdays. The little girl gasped. It's his birthday today. Charles leaned toward the display. Then he'd better have one. Her mother laughed so hard she bought 4. As soon as they left, I shook my head. You just invented rabbit birthdays. I panicked. You could have said rabbits eat carrots. Too predictable. You are unbelievable. You laughed. I did. So it worked. I hated how right he was. About a month after Charles started, Mrs. Reynolds made an announcement. I need one of you to help with the Saturday farmers market. Charles looked at me. I looked at Charles. Mrs. Reynolds smiled knowingly. Congratulations. You're both volunteering. We are? You are now. Saturday mornings at the market were chaotic. We loaded dozens of bread baskets into the bakery van before sunrise. By 7:30, people were already lining up. Charles carried wooden crates while I arranged pastries beneath a white canopy. The town square slowly filled with flower vendors, local farmers, handmade soap stands, and musicians who somehow knew every customer by name. Charles looked around. So this is where everyone disappears on Saturdays. Pretty much. It's nice. You sound surprised. I expected something smaller. This is small. He laughed. I guess I'm getting used to it. For hours we barely stopped moving. Sell bread. Answer questions. Restock. Smile. Repeat. Near noon the crowd finally slowed. Charles leaned against the van, exhausted. How are there this many people in one town? They multiply on weekends. I believe that. I handed him a bottle of water. He looked genuinely tired. You okay? He nodded. Just not used to smiling this much. You've been smiling all morning. I know. That's illegal? It's exhausting. I couldn't stop grinning. You've changed. He frowned. What do you mean? The first week you barely talked. I barely knew anyone. And now? He looked across the square where Mrs. Jenkins was waving enthusiastically from another stall. Now apparently everyone knows my name. They do. He watched the crowd quietly. I think I like it. Something about the way he said it stayed with me the rest of the day. After packing everything back into the van, we stopped at the small diner on the edge of town. Not because we planned to. Because both of us were too tired to cook. The waitress didn't even hand us menus. The usual? I blinked. We have a usual? Charles looked equally confused. She smiled. You've been here 3 Saturdays in a row. I laughed. I guess we do. Charles leaned back in the booth. That's dangerous. What is? Small towns. Because? You accidentally become a regular somewhere. Too late. He looked around the diner. Families. Retired couples. Teenagers sharing fries after baseball practice. Everyone greeting everyone. I've never lived somewhere like this. You don't like cities? They're fine. But? They're lonely. The answer surprised me. You seemed like someone who preferred quiet. I do. So why lonely? He stirred his coffee for a few seconds before answering. In cities you can disappear. I nodded. Here. He glanced toward the waitress greeting another customer by name. People notice if you're missing. Neither of us spoke for a while. Because I understood exactly what he meant. The drive back was unusually quiet. Not uncomfortable. Comfortable. The kind where silence didn't need filling. About halfway home, Charles suddenly asked, Can I ask you something? Sure. Why are you still here? I looked over. What do you mean? You said this job was temporary. I laughed. I talk too much. You do. So why? I watched the empty country road stretch ahead. I don't know anymore. You ever think about leaving? Sometimes. But? I shrugged. It stopped feeling urgent. Charles looked out the passenger window. I get that. You do? I moved here planning to stay 6 months. And now? He smiled faintly. I'm looking at apartments. Something warm settled quietly in my chest. The following week brought the biggest order the bakery had ever received. A wedding. 300 guests. Dozens of cakes. Hundreds of pastries. Enough bread to feed half the county. Mrs. Reynolds looked at both of us. If we survive this, we deserve raises? I offered. We deserve sleep. Charles nodded immediately. I'll take sleep. For 3 straight days we barely left the kitchen. Mixing. Baking. Decorating. Cleaning. Repeating. Late Thursday night I nearly dropped an entire tray of pastries. Charles caught it before it hit the floor. Nice save. I've got you. The words came naturally. Without thinking. Without hesitation. I looked at him. He looked back. Neither of us said anything. Mrs. Reynolds interrupted from across the kitchen. If you two are done staring at each other. We both jumped. Those eclairs won't decorate themselves. Charles cleared his throat. Right. I focused very intensely on chocolate glaze. But for the rest of the evening, I kept replaying one sentence. I've got you. It shouldn't have meant anything. Except, for some reason, it did. By the time the wedding order was finished, both of us looked like we'd aged 5 years. Mrs. Reynolds stood in the middle of the kitchen, hands on her hips, inspecting the empty racks. I've decided something. Charles looked up from washing mixing bowls. I'm nervous. You should be. She smiled. The bakery is closed tomorrow. I blinked. What? You heard me. Charles frowned. But it's Friday. And? We're always open. Not this week. She pointed toward both of us. You've earned a day off. Neither of us argued. Mostly because we were too exhausted to think. The next morning I slept until almost 9. For someone who usually woke up before dawn, it felt almost illegal. I was halfway through making breakfast when my phone buzzed. Charles. You awake? I smiled before answering. Barely. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Coffee? I stared at the screen for a second. Then typed the only reasonable response. Give me 20 minutes. The cafe on Main Street was one of those places that somehow hadn't changed in 30 years. Same wooden booths. Same old radio behind the counter. Same owner who somehow remembered everyone's favorite drink. Charles was already there when I walked in. He waved from the corner booth. You look rested. I've slept 12 hours. I'm jealous. You were the one who texted me. I got bored. You've been off work for 3 hours. I know. I laughed as I sat down. You really don't know how to relax. I've never been very good at it. The waitress appeared. The usual? Charles looked confused again. How do we already have another usual? She shrugged. You come in together enough. I caught Charles trying not to smile. For a while we talked about nothing. Movies. Music. The bakery. Whether Mrs. Reynolds secretly possessed magical baking abilities. I'm serious, I insisted. No one makes pie crust like that naturally. Charles nodded thoughtfully. So you're saying she's a wizard? I'm saying we should investigate. How? We searched the basement. What basement? Exactly. He laughed into his coffee. You've watched too many mystery shows. That's not evidence. It absolutely is. Around noon we wandered through town without any real destination. It was strange seeing each other somewhere that wasn't covered in flour. Charles stopped outside the bookstore. You ever been in there? 100 times. Worth it? If you like books. I do. Then yes. The tiny bookstore smelled like old paper and coffee. Wooden shelves stretched almost to the ceiling. A gray cat slept beside the checkout counter without moving. Charles immediately crouched beside it. Hey! The cat ignored him completely. I don't think he likes you. He hasn't given me a chance. You've had 30 seconds. Charles reached out carefully. The cat opened one eye. Thought about it. Then deliberately turned around. I burst out laughing. You've been rejected. He's playing hard to get. He's asleep. Exactly. The owner looked over her glasses. He only likes people after the third visit. Charles stood. So there's still hope. We spent nearly an hour browsing shelves. Eventually I noticed Charles standing in the travel section. You planning another move? He looked down at the book in his hands. No. But I used to. What changed? He closed the book slowly. I got tired. Of moving? He nodded. I kept thinking the next town would feel different. And it never really did. We walked quietly toward the register. I think, he said carefully, I was looking for something that wasn't actually a place. I looked at him. What was it? He smiled faintly. I'll let you know if I figure it out. By late afternoon, dark clouds rolled across town. You think it'll rain? I asked. Charles looked up. I think we're about 5 minutes away from getting soaked. He wasn't wrong. The first drops fell before we'd even reached the truck. By the time we climbed inside, rain hammered against the windshield so hard we could barely see the road. Guess we're not driving anywhere. Charles leaned back in his seat. I don't mind. Neither did I. The rain created a strange little world around us. Everything outside blurred. The truck became oddly quiet. Comfortable. After several minutes, Charles spoke. Can I ask you something? You ask that a lot. I know. Go ahead. He watched the rain instead of looking at me. Were you ever close to leaving? I knew exactly what he meant. Last year? He nodded. Yeah. What stopped you? I thought about it honestly. I realized I wasn't running toward anything. And I was just running away from feeling stuck. Charles stayed quiet. So I stayed? He nodded slowly. I think I did the opposite. What do you mean? I kept moving because I thought eventually somewhere would feel like home. He laughed softly. It never did. I looked out at the rain. Maybe home isn't a place. He turned toward me. Then what is it? I opened my mouth. Then stopped. Because for some reason, the first answer that came to mind was sitting in the passenger seat. Instead, I shrugged. I don't know. When the rain finally eased, the sun was already beginning to set. The roads glistened orange beneath the evening light. As I drove Charles back toward his apartment, neither of us rushed the conversation. Some silences deserve to exist. When we reached his building, he didn't open the door immediately. Thanks. For coffee? For today. I smiled. You don't have to thank me. I know. Another pause. I haven't had a day like that in, honestly, I don't remember. I looked at him. It was just coffee. It wasn't. He smiled. See you Saturday? 5:30. Don't be late. I never am. He climbed out of the truck. Halfway to the building, he turned back. Oh. Yeah? I think the bookstore cat secretly likes me. I laughed. You're delusional. We'll know after visit number 3. Then he disappeared inside. Saturday morning felt strangely different. Nothing had actually changed. Same ovens. Same flour-covered counters. Same customers. Yet everything felt lighter. Mrs. Reynolds watched us from across the kitchen with a knowing expression. Finally, she sighed dramatically. I'm getting old. Charles looked confused. What brought that on? I remember when young people used to actually notice they were flirting. Both of us froze. I'm sorry. Mrs. Reynolds continued icing cupcakes. I'm just saying. Charles cleared his throat. We're not. She raised one hand. I didn't ask. Neither of us spoke for almost 5 full minutes. Finally, Charles whispered. Do we flirt? I answered without looking up. I honestly have no idea. He nodded. Me either. But the strange thing was, for the rest of the morning, neither of us could stop wondering. For the next week, Mrs. Reynolds seemed to find endless reasons to leave Charles and me alone. I need someone to organize the storage room. She looked directly at us. You too. The next day it was. The freezer needs inventory. Again. Us. By Thursday, even Charles noticed. I think she's doing this on purpose. You think? Definitely. We carried boxes of flour into the storage room while Mrs. Reynolds hummed suspiciously loud from the front counter. Charles sighed. I've been set up. I think we both have. He laughed. I'm not complaining. The words slipped out so naturally that neither of us reacted right away. Then we both looked at each other. Charles scratched the back of his neck. I meant. I know. He smiled, relieved. Good. Except. I wasn't entirely sure I did know. The following Saturday, the bakery closed earlier than usual. Main Street was preparing for the annual summer festival. Every year the entire town transformed. Live music. Food stands. Games. Fireworks. Half the county showed up. Mrs. Reynolds locked the bakery door. You boys are still coming tonight? I wasn't planning to, I admitted. She looked horrified. Timothy. What? You've lived here your whole life. I know. You are going. Charles looked between us. Is attendance mandatory? Absolutely. He laughed. I guess I'm going too. Mrs. Reynolds smiled triumphantly. Excellent. That evening the town barely looked recognizable. String lights stretched across Main Street. Children ran between booths carrying oversized cotton candy. Someone was already playing country music from the stage in the square. Charles stopped walking. This is a small-town festival? You expected smaller? I expected maybe 3 tables. I laughed. We take festivals seriously. Apparently. Within 5 minutes Mrs. Jenkins had already stopped us twice. Mr. Carter insisted Charles try homemade barbecue. The mayor somehow remembered Charles's name despite only meeting him once. Charles leaned closer as we walked. Does everyone know everyone? Pretty much. That's terrifying. You'll get used to it. I'm not convinced. We wandered through the crowd for almost an hour. Neither of us had any real plan. That was the point. At one booth, an older woman sold handmade wooden carvings. Charles picked up a tiny carved fox. That's kind of nice. The woman smiled. Your boyfriend has good taste. Silence. Complete silence. Charles almost dropped the fox. He glanced at me. We're. I quickly smiled. We work together. Oh. The woman laughed. My mistake. Charles smiled politely while paying for the carving anyway. We walked away without speaking. About 20 steps later, I finally asked. You okay? He stared ahead. Yeah. You sure? I just wasn't expecting that. Neither was I. We found an empty bench near the river where the music sounded softer. Charles turned the little wooden fox over in his hands. My grandmother collected these. I didn't know that. I don't talk about my family much. No. I know. He was quiet for a while. Then finally said, My grandparents raised me. I looked over. My parents worked all the time. He smiled faintly. So Grandma baked. That explains a lot. What? You're really good. He laughed. She was better. I doubt it. No. His smile turned nostalgic. She made everyone feel welcome. Something in his expression changed. I think that's why I became a baker. I waited. When people came into her kitchen, he looked toward the lights across the river. They always left happier. The sentence stayed with me. Because that was exactly what Charles did every day. As darkness settled over town, everyone gathered near the riverbank for fireworks. The crowd packed tightly together. Families. Friends. Neighbors. Someone accidentally bumped into me from behind. Without thinking, Charles reached out to steady me. His hand caught my arm for only a second. then immediately pulled away. Neither of us mentioned it. The first firework exploded overhead. Gold. Then blue. Children cheered. Everyone looked toward the sky. I glanced sideways instead. The colorful light reflected across Charles's face. He wasn't watching the fireworks anymore. He was watching the people watching them. Smiling. Quietly. Like seeing everyone else happy somehow mattered more to him than the show itself. I don't know why. But that moment stayed with me more than any firework. After the festival ended, we walked back through nearly empty streets. The town felt peaceful again. Charles kicked a loose pebble along the sidewalk. Can I tell you something? Always. I almost didn't take this job. Really? He nodded. I had another offer. Where? Chicago. I stopped walking. Seriously? Yeah. What made you choose here? He laughed softly. Honestly? Yeah. I flipped a coin. I stared at him. A coin? I couldn't decide. So your entire life changed because of a coin toss? Pretty much. I shook my head. That's insane. I know. We started walking again. After a minute, he quietly added, I think it made the right choice. Something tightened gently in my chest. I think so too. The next morning, Mrs. Reynolds was unusually cheerful. So, she pretended to wipe flour off the counter. How was the festival? It was fun, Charles answered. She looked directly at me. Anything interesting happen? I frowned. Not really. Oh. She sounded almost disappointed. Charles hid a smile. What? I asked. Nothing. Mrs. Reynolds continued smiling to herself. A few days later, just before closing, heavy rain started falling. The kind that floods Main Street within minutes. Charles looked out the front window. I walked. I grabbed my truck keys. I'll drive you. You don't have to. I know. He smiled. I've noticed you say that a lot. Say what? You don't have to. You never actually seem to mind doing things for people. I shrugged. My dad always said kindness isn't supposed to be convenient. Charles looked at me for a long second. He sounds like a good man. He is. The drive to his apartment took less than 5 minutes. Neither of us rushed to end it. When we pulled up outside the hardware store, the rain was somehow even heavier. Charles reached for the door. Then stopped. Hey, Timothy? Yeah? I'm glad I flipped that coin. For a second. Neither of us looked away. There wasn't anything dramatic about the moment. No confession. No grand realization. Just two people sitting in an old pickup truck while rain drummed softly against the roof. And yet, when Charles finally stepped out and disappeared into the storm, I realized something I had been avoiding for weeks. I wasn't looking forward to seeing him because he was my coworker anymore. I was looking forward to seeing him because he was Charles. And that scared me far more than I wanted to admit. Once I admitted the truth to myself, pretending became much harder. Nothing between Charles and me changed. At least, not on the surface. We still opened the bakery before sunrise. Still argued over whose coffee tasted better. Still laughed whenever someone asked the same question we'd already answered 20 times that morning. But every little moment suddenly carried more weight. If our hands brushed while reaching for the same tray, I noticed. If he smiled at me across the kitchen, I noticed. If he laughed, I definitely noticed. The problem wasn't Charles. The problem was me. About 2 weeks later, Mrs. Reynolds walked into the kitchen holding an envelope. Good news. Charles looked up. Should we be worried? Probably. She handed us the paper. Our bakery was invited to the regional baking competition. I blinked. We've never entered. I know. Charles scanned the invitation. It's in Brookfield. Next month. Mrs. Reynolds folded her arms. I've already accepted. You accepted before asking us? Obviously. Charles laughed. So we don't have a choice. You absolutely do. She smiled. But if either of you says no. She dramatically looked toward the ovens. I'll be personally offended. Preparations started immediately. The competition required one signature bread, one pastry, and one original dessert. Mrs. Reynolds insisted Charles and I design everything together. Which meant long evenings after closing, recipe testing, taste testing, arguing over ingredients. Mostly arguing. I still think cinnamon is too strong. Charles crossed his arms. It's barely noticeable. I noticed. You notice everything. Exactly. So you're proving my point. I sighed dramatically. You're impossible. You've mentioned that before. Because it's true. Mrs. Reynolds walked past carrying a tray. I've decided. Neither of us looked up. What? You two argue like an old married couple. Complete silence. She disappeared before either of us could respond. Charles cleared his throat. She's going to keep doing that. I know. One evening we stayed almost 2 hours after closing. The bakery was quiet except for the hum of refrigerators. Charles pulled another batch of pastries from the oven. What do you think? I tasted one. Closed my eyes. Needs more orange zest. He groaned. I knew you were going to say that. You asked? I was hoping you'd suddenly lose your sense of taste. Convenient. I thought so. He started writing notes in a small notebook. I'd noticed him carrying it for weeks. You write everything down. I forget things. You've never forgotten anything. I forget what I forgot. That's confusing. It is. I watched him scribble another line. What else is in there? He hesitated. Recipes. Shopping lists. He smiled. Random thoughts. I raised an eyebrow. Random thoughts? Mostly ideas. For baking? Sometimes. I pointed toward the notebook. Can I see? He thought about it. Then slowly handed it over. Most pages really were recipes. Measurements. Ideas. Little sketches of cake designs. Then I reached one page. At the top it simply said, Things I like about this town. Below it was a list. The river at sunset. The bookstore cat. Mrs. Reynolds pretending not to care. Fresh bread before sunrise. The festival. People remembering my name. Near the bottom. One final line. Working with Timothy. I stared at the page a little too long. Charles quietly reached over and closed the notebook. I forgot that was in there. Either of us spoke. Because suddenly, the bakery felt very small. The following Saturday the town held its annual charity picnic. Mrs. Reynolds insisted the bakery sponsor a booth. Around lunchtime she disappeared. I'll be back. Charles looked around. Where's she going? No idea. 20 minutes later she still hadn't returned. Instead, my mother walked up. Oh, no. Charles smiled politely. You must be Timothy's mom. She beamed. And you must be Charles. I watched this disaster unfold in slow motion. She shook his hand enthusiastically. I've heard wonderful things about you. Charles glanced toward me. You have? I looked at the sky. Maybe lightning would save me. He talks about you all the time. Mom. What? You do, she continued cheerfully. Almost every dinner. Charles looked genuinely surprised. I didn't know that. I didn't either. I muttered. Mom ignored me. He says you're patient. I closed my eyes. And talented. Please stop. And kind. Charles looked at me. I refused to make eye contact. Finally, Mom smiled sweetly. Well, I'll let you boys get back to work. She walked away. Far too pleased with herself. Charles waited until she disappeared into the crowd. Every dinner? I sighed. My mother exaggerates. Does she? A little. He smiled. I don't mind. That somehow made everything worse. That evening, after the picnic ended, we loaded empty trays into the truck. Charles suddenly asked, "Can I ask something without making this weird?" My heart skipped. "Depends." He laughed. "Fair." He leaned against the truck. "Why haven't you left?" I frowned. "We've talked about this." "No." He shook his head. "I mean now." I looked at him. "You could leave tomorrow if you wanted." "I could." "But you don't." "No." "Why?" The honest answer sat right there. Because somewhere along the way, this town had stopped being the reason I stayed. He had. But I wasn't brave enough to say that. So instead I answered, "I think I finally found something worth staying for." Charles looked at me carefully. He didn't ask what. Maybe. He was afraid of the answer too. The competition was only a week away now. Everyone was nervous. Even Mrs. Reynolds admitted it. The bakery stayed open later than usual every evening. Practice after practice. Recipe after recipe. One night, while cleaning the kitchen, the power suddenly went out. Everything went dark. Charles laughed immediately. "Perfect timing." Mrs. Reynolds called from somewhere near the office. "Don't move!" "I'm already not moving," I answered. Charles was somewhere beside me. "I think I found the flashlight." A loud crash echoed through the kitchen. "Never mind." I burst out laughing. "You okay?" I walked into a chair. "How?" "It attacked me." Even in complete darkness. He somehow managed to make me laugh. A minute later, emergency lights flickered on. Soft, golden light filled the bakery. Charles stood a few feet away, flour on his shirt, holding the flashlight upside down. "You found it." "I did. Eventually." He looked at me. Then started laughing again. I joined him. Neither of us even remembered why. And standing there, in the middle of a dark bakery, laughing over absolutely nothing, I realized I hadn't felt this happy in years. That realization was both wonderful and terrifying. Because if Charles ever walked out of my life, I wasn't sure the bakery or the town would ever feel the same again. The morning of the competition started at 3:30. Not because we had to. Because none of us had slept anyway. Mrs. Reynolds unlocked the bakery while the rest of Main Street was still completely dark. Charles was already there. Of course he was. "You've been here long?" He looked up from organizing boxes. "About 20 minutes. You couldn't sleep either?" He smiled. "I kept dreaming we forgot the bread. I dreamed I dropped the cake." Mrs. Reynolds walked in carrying coffee. "I dreamed you two stopped worrying." Charles and I looked at each other. "That one's definitely unrealistic." Brookfield was about 90 minutes away. The bakery van smelled like fresh bread, oranges, butter, and coffee. Mrs. Reynolds drove. Charles sat beside me in the back, making sure every box stayed perfectly still. "You've checked those straps 6 times." He looked down. 7. I laughed. "The bread isn't going anywhere." "I know. You don't sound convinced." "I'm not." The competition took place inside a renovated community hall. Nearly 30 bakeries had entered. Some displays looked almost impossible. Towering cakes, intricate pastries, chocolate sculptures that belonged in museums. Charles stared around the room. "We're competing against these?" Mrs. Reynolds didn't even blink. "No. We're not. We're competing against ourselves." Charles smiled. "I like that answer." "So do I." For the next few hours, everything happened in a blur. Judges. Questions. Last-minute adjustments. Waiting. So much waiting. Eventually, there was nothing left to do. Charles stood beside one of the large windows overlooking the town square. I joined him. "Nervous?" He nodded. "You? Worse." He laughed quietly. I figured. Neither of us looked at each other. Instead, we watched people walking below. Finally, he spoke. "You know." "Yeah? If we don't win. I looked over. I'm still proud of what we made. I smiled. Me too. The awards ceremony began just after 4. Third place. Not us. Second place. Still not us. I glanced toward Charles. He looked perfectly calm. Or at least, he pretended well. And first place. The announcer opened the envelope. Reynolds Bakery. For a second, none of us moved. Mrs. Reynolds blinked. Charles looked at me. I looked back at him. Did they say us? I think so. Mrs. Reynolds finally laughed. Oh, for heaven's sake. She gently pushed both of us forward. Go. Everything after that felt unreal. Photos. Congratulations. Interviews with the local newspaper. People asking questions. Someone handed Charles the trophy. He immediately passed it to Mrs. Reynolds. No. She pushed it back. This belongs to all 3 of us. Charles hesitated. Then smiled. I've never won anything before. Something about the way he said it made my chest tighten. You deserved this. He looked at me. So did you. The drive home was louder than the drive there. Mrs. Reynolds sang terribly to old songs on the radio. Charles actually laughed. At one point she suddenly announced, We're celebrating. I thought we already were. No. She grinned. I mean tomorrow. The bakery? Closed. Again. Charles looked at me. I'm beginning to like winning. News traveled impossibly fast. By the time we returned to town, someone had already hung a handwritten sign in the bakery window. Congratulations. Customers started appearing before we had even unpacked the van. Mrs. Jenkins hugged Mrs. Reynolds. Mr. Carter insisted we accept homemade pie. The mayor stopped by. Apparently everyone considered the victory theirs too. Charles leaned toward me while another customer congratulated us. I forgot how small this town is. You'll never forget again. Late that evening, after everyone finally left, we sat on the bakery steps eating slices of pie. Neither of us had enough energy to speak much. The street was almost empty. Warm summer air drifted through town. Charles quietly said, I have something. He reached into his backpack. It was the small notebook. He flipped through several pages. Then carefully tore one out. Here. I looked down. It was another list. At the top he'd written, Reasons I stayed. My apartment. Mrs. Reynolds. The bakery. The river. Saturday mornings. The bookstore. This town. I smiled. It's a good list. Keep reading. Near the bottom. One final line. Timothy. Just my name. Nothing else. No explanation. No joke. Just Timothy. I looked up slowly. Charles was watching me carefully. I wrote that a while ago. Either of us spoke. I kept meaning to remove it. My heart sank slightly. Then he smiled. But every time I opened the notebook, he took a slow breath. I realized I didn't want to. The world seemed to become strangely quiet. No cars. No voices. Only the distant sound of crickets. I don't really know when it happened, he admitted. I think. He laughed softly. Maybe somewhere between coffee, arguing about cinnamon, and that ridiculous race in the rain. I couldn't stop smiling. I remember the race. You cheated. I absolutely didn't. You did. I still won. He shook his head. You'll never admit it. No. We both laughed. The nervousness eased just enough. Finally, I looked at him. I should probably tell you something. He waited. When you asked why I stayed. Yeah? I wasn't completely honest. His expression softened. I guessed. I stayed because this town started feeling different. He nodded once. And then, I took a slow breath. You became the reason. Charles looked down for a second. Then back at me. I was hoping you'd say that. Neither of us rushed toward each other. Neither of us tried to fill the silence. We simply sat there. Two men who had somehow gone from strangers to coworkers to best friends, and finally, to admitting what had been quietly growing between them all along. Charles smiled. So, would it be okay if I kissed you? I laughed softly. You still ask permission for everything. I do. I like that. I nodded once. Yes. We shared a brief, gentle kiss beneath the warm glow of the bakery lights. When we pulled back, both of us were smiling. I guess, Charles said quietly, that coin really knew what it was doing. I laughed. For once. I think you're right. The strange thing about finally telling the truth was that almost nothing changed. And somehow, everything did. The bakery still opened before sunrise. The coffee still tasted better when Charles made it. Mrs. Reynolds still complained every morning that we used too many mixing bowls. Life looked exactly the same. Only now, I didn't have to wonder why seeing Charles made every day easier. I already knew. Monday morning I arrived first. 5 minutes later the back door opened. Charles stepped inside carrying 2 coffees. He smiled the moment he saw me. Morning. Morning. There was a tiny pause. The kind neither of us knew how to navigate yet. Then Charles held out 1 cup. I figured this part shouldn't change. It definitely shouldn't. He leaned against the counter. So? We're still figuring this out. I hope so. He nodded. Good. It felt wonderfully ordinary. Mrs. Reynolds walked into the kitchen 10 minutes later. She looked at us. Then at the 2 coffees. Then back at us. Something in her expression shifted. Finally, Charles nearly dropped his mug. What? She laughed. Oh, don't look so surprised. I blinked. You knew? Knew? She placed a tray onto the counter. I've known for months. Months? She pointed a wooden spoon toward us. You two smiled differently around each other. Charles looked completely defeated. That's how you figured it out? No. She grinned. The smiling just confirmed it. What gave it away? Mrs. Reynolds started counting on her fingers. 2 coffees every morning. She raised another finger. One of you always looking for the other. Another. You never ate lunch unless the other one was free. Charles looked at me. Did we really do that? I thought about it. Apparently. And finally, Mrs. Reynolds smiled warmly. I've spent 40 years watching people fall in love. She shrugged. You stopped missing the signs. Neither of us knew what to say. She rescued us. Now quit staring at each other. She pointed toward the ovens. Those rolls won't bake themselves. Keeping our relationship quiet for a while wasn't really a decision. It just happened naturally. Not because we were hiding. Simply because it still felt new. Something precious. Something we wanted to understand ourselves before the entire town decided to have opinions. That lasted almost 9 days. On the 10th day, Mrs. Jenkins caught us. Not doing anything dramatic. Charles had simply reached over to brush a little flour off my shoulder. She walked around the corner at exactly the wrong moment. Oh. We both stepped back automatically. Mrs. Jenkins smiled. Well? Nobody spoke. It's about time. Charles looked confused. You knew too? My dear. She laughed softly. The whole town has been waiting. I stared at her. The whole town? She nodded as though discussing tomorrow's weather. You two weren't exactly subtle. After she left, Charles turned toward me. I thought we were being careful. So did I. Apparently. We were the only ones. Within another week, everyone seemed to know. Not because anyone announced it. Because small towns don't require announcements. Mrs. Carter brought us homemade cookies. The owner of the bookstore quietly gave Charles a discount. Even the cat finally allowed Charles to pet him. I told you. He looked ridiculously proud. I've earned his respect. You've earned something. What? Validation. I'll take it. The biggest surprise came one Sunday afternoon. Charles and I were repainting the bakery's old front bench. Mrs. Reynolds insisted it had needed doing. Since last summer. Halfway through the project, my father walked over carrying a toolbox. You missed a spot. I know. He picked up another paintbrush. I figured you might need help. For 20 minutes we worked in comfortable silence. Finally, Dad looked at Charles. So? Charles froze slightly. So? I'm glad you're here. Charles blinked. Thank you? Dad nodded once. He smiles more. Charles looked toward me. I've noticed. Dad smiled faintly. Good. That was the entire conversation. Simple. Quiet. Exactly the kind of man my father had always been. Later, after he walked away, Charles said softly, I understand where you get it now. Get what? The kindness. I looked down at the fresh paint drying on the bench. He taught me. I can tell. Summer slowly turned toward early autumn. The mornings became cooler. Customers started asking for pumpkin bread again. Leaves collected along the sidewalks outside the bakery. One evening, after closing, Charles locked the front door and looked across Main Street. Remember when I thought I'd stay 6 months? I laughed. You made it sound temporary. I believed it. And now? He looked around the quiet little town. The bookstore. The diner. The river beyond the trees. The bakery glowing warmly behind us. I don't think I'm leaving. Good. He smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. A few weeks later, the regional newspaper published an article about the competition. There was a photo of all three of us standing outside the bakery. Mrs. Reynolds proudly held the trophy. Charles stood beside her. I stood beside Charles. The headline read, Small Town Bakery Wins Big Through Teamwork. Mrs. Reynolds framed it immediately. It belongs on the wall. Charles studied the picture. We all look happy. We were. He looked at me. We still are. I nodded. Yeah. We really were. Sometimes I think back to the first morning Charles walked through the bakery door. A stranger carrying a backpack. Looking completely lost. If someone had told me then that one ordinary handshake would become the beginning of the most important chapter of my life, I never would have believed them. But that's the funny thing about life. It rarely announces the moments that matter most. Sometimes, they begin with a cup of coffee, a shared laugh, an argument about cinnamon, or a race through the rain that neither person ever truly admits losing. And sometimes, home isn't the place you were born, or the place you plan to stay. Sometimes, home is simply the person who quietly makes every ordinary day feel like exactly where you're meant to be. Autumn arrived quietly. The mornings became colder. Steam lingered above coffee cups a little longer. People started wearing jackets before sunrise, and every time the bakery door opened, crisp air swept inside carrying the smell of fallen leaves. Charles claimed autumn had always been his favorite season. I thought summer was. He shook his head while arranging fresh loaves. Summer is loud. And autumn? He smiled. Autumn lets you breathe. That sounded exactly like something Charles would say. Business became even busier than usual. People wanted pumpkin bread, apple turnovers, cinnamon rolls every weekend. Mrs. Reynolds declared October the month where nobody sleeps. She wasn't entirely wrong. One particularly busy Friday morning, a little boy walked into the bakery with his father. He couldn't have been older than 6. He pointed directly at Charles. That's the bread guy. Charles laughed. I guess I am. The boy looked at his father. I told you. His father smiled. He talks about this bakery all week. Charles knelt slightly so they were eye level. That's a lot of pressure. You make the best cinnamon rolls. Charles glanced toward me. I had help. The little boy looked at both of us. You always work together. We do. I like that. So did I. The bookstore cat finally decided Charles was acceptable company. It happened on our third or maybe fourth visit. The old gray cat climbed onto the arm of Charles's chair and settled there like it had always belonged. I stared in disbelief. This feels unfair. Charles looked far too pleased with himself. I told you. I've known that cat for years. I know. He ignored me for 6 months. Charles gently scratched behind the cat's ears. Some friendships just take time. I think you're showing off. I absolutely am. The bookstore owner walked by and laughed. I've never seen him warm up that quickly. Charles looked at me with exaggerated confidence. I'm choosing to believe I'm special. You definitely are. The words came out before I had time to think. Charles looked at me. Neither of us looked away. The bookstore owner quietly disappeared into another aisle with the kind of smile only people who have witnessed something genuine can wear. Near the end of October, Mrs. Reynolds called us into the kitchen. I've been thinking. Charles immediately looked suspicious. That usually means extra work. It does. She handed us an envelope. What is it? Open it. Inside was a certificate. I read it twice before looking up. Partner? Mrs. Reynolds nodded. I'm getting older. Neither of us interrupted. I don't plan on retiring tomorrow. She smiled. But someday. Charles looked stunned. You want us to? I want the bakery to stay exactly what it's always been. She looked around the kitchen. This place has survived 43 years. She looked at both of us. I think it'll survive a few more. I swallowed hard. You trust us? She laughed. I trusted you months ago. Charles looked almost speechless. I don't know what to say. Say yes. We both did. That evening we stayed after closing. Not because there was work left. Because neither of us wanted to leave yet. Charles stood behind the counter looking around the empty bakery. Can you imagine? What? Owning this place. I smiled. I can now. He laughed softly. I used to think success meant leaving. And now? He looked toward the front windows where evening lights reflected across Main Street. I think success is building something people don't want to leave. I looked around. The worn wooden floors. The display cases. The old chalkboard menu. The oven still warm from the day's baking. Then I looked at Charles. I think we're already doing that. Winter arrived earlier than expected. The first snowfall came just after Thanksgiving. Main Street looked completely different beneath fresh snow. The bakery windows glowed warmly against the white streets. Inside, everything smelled like gingerbread, cinnamon, and fresh coffee. One morning, before customers arrived, Charles stood outside watching snow fall. I joined him. It's beautiful. It is. He smiled. I've lived in 5 different towns. I looked over. This is the first one that ever felt like mine. I reached for his hand. He smiled immediately. You know. I know. If that coin had landed differently. It didn't. No. He squeezed my hand gently. It didn't. Just before Christmas Eve, the bakery was packed. Customers filled every table. Children pressed their noses against the display case, deciding which cookies Santa might prefer. Mrs. Reynolds somehow managed to remember every order without writing anything down. Near closing time, the little boy from October came back. He looked at Charles. Will you still be here next year? Charles smiled. I hope so. The boy nodded confidently. Good. Then he looked at me. And you? I'm not going anywhere. Satisfied, he grabbed his mother's hand and walked out. Charles watched them leave. I like this town. I know. I love this bakery. I know. He looked at me one last time. And I love you. It was the first time he'd said it out loud. Simple. Quiet. Completely certain. I smiled before answering. I love you too. Mrs. Reynolds called from the kitchen without even looking up. I heard that. Charles laughed. I know you did. I've been waiting 6 months. We laughed together. Sometimes people ask me why I never left. I usually smile and tell them life changed. That's true. Just not in the way they expect. I thought I needed a bigger city, a better job, a completely different future. Instead, I found everything I'd been searching for inside a small bakery on Main Street. I found purpose in the smell of fresh bread before sunrise. I found family in a woman who treated every employee like her own child. I found a community where people remembered your name simply because they cared. And I found Charles. The quiet man who walked through the bakery door carrying a backpack and looking like he didn't quite know where he belonged. It turns out, neither of us did. Not until we found each other. People say love changes your life. Maybe they're right. But looking back, it wasn't one dramatic moment that changed mine. It was hundreds of ordinary ones. Morning coffee before sunrise. Shared laughter over burnt pastries. Long days preparing bread. Conversations in the rain. A notebook with my name written on the last line. A first kiss beneath the bakery lights. The simple decision to stay. Years from now, customers probably won't remember which competition we won. They won't remember the newspaper article or the trophy. What they'll remember is how the bakery made them feel. Warm. Welcome. At home. And every morning, before the first customer opens the door, Charles and I still arrive while the town is asleep. He starts the dough. I make the coffee. We smile at each other across the kitchen. The ovens warm the room. The smell of fresh bread slowly drifts through Main Street. Another ordinary day begins. And honestly, I can't imagine a better life than the one that started with a simple handshake in a little bakery in a small town.